The girl in the portrait was sold into marriage at 13 to a man who was assassinated 8 months later. She was widowed before she turned 14. The painting was cut directly out of a book she was bound in, sometime in the 1800s, and sold as an anonymous work. For 400 years, nobody knew Leonardo painted it. It was sold in a New York auction in 1998 for $21,000 and is now worth $150 million. The Christie's auction catalog for January 30th, 1998 described her plainly. A portrait of a young woman in profile, done in colored chalks and ink on vellum, probably from the German school, 19th century. A description so inert it put people to sleep on their feet. And so, everyone walked on. A New York art dealer named Jean Marchig paid $19,000 for the piece and walked out with it, completely unaware she'd just acquired a Leonardo. In 2007, a Canadian art scholar named Martin Kemp, a man whose entire career had been devoted to studying Leonardo da Vinci, who had quite literally written the book, several of them actually on the subject, was shown a photograph of the drawing. He looked at it. He looked at it again. And then, by his own account, he felt the floor shift slightly beneath him. Kemp is a man who resists wild claims. He is, in the way that only decades of serious scholarship can produce, extremely careful. He has the kind of measured, deliberate quality that makes you trust him instinctively, the way you trust a doctor who takes a long pause before speaking, rather than one who immediately tells you everything is fine. When Martin Kemp says something is significant, it is wise to pay attention. What he saw in that photograph, and later, in the drawing itself, went well beyond a pretty portrait. It was a constellation of specific, almost fingerprint-like qualities that he had spent his career learning to recognize. The way the light fell across the cheekbone, the handling of the hair, individual strands suggesting movement even in stillness. The particular quality of attention in the pose, the subject alive, inhabited, fully present, and the vellum itself, a material Leonardo was known to use, stretched and prepared in ways consistent with late 15th century Milanese workshops. He called it, after extensive study, a work by Leonardo da Vinci, probably dating to around 1496. Here's the thing about Leonardo that people forget, buried as he is under centuries of hagiography and that famous half-smile. He was deeply, gloriously, almost pathologically weird. He was a man who wrote backwards in his notebooks, habitually his mirror script flowing right to left as naturally as most people breathe. He was, by all accounts, vegetarian in an era when that was practically incomprehensible. He was almost certainly gay, in a time and place where that was formally illegal, and yet lived in the kind of open, ambiguous domesticity that suggests he cared very little about what the neighbors thought. He dissected more than 30 human corpses, which was also somewhat illegal. He kept meticulous notes on the muscles of the tongue and the structure of the iris. He designed flying machines, armored vehicles, solar power concentrators, and a robot. He was also, as an aside, a painter of such uncanny skill that his contemporaries described him as having been gifted directly by God, which was both a compliment and, one suspects, a way of processing something that felt otherwise inexplicable. He painted very little. This is the part that genuinely astonishes people. Given his output in every other direction, the notebooks alone run to thousands of pages. The number of finished paintings reliably attributed to him sits somewhere between 15 and 20, depending on which scholars are arguing that week. He was constitutionally incapable of finishing things. He would spend years on a commission, become distracted by the problem of how wings worked or the acoustics of a cathedral, and leave his patrons' walls empty and their patience destroyed, which is precisely why the discovery of a previously unknown Leonardo, if that is what this is, matters so enormously. Every new work is a window, improbably preserved, into one of the most singular minds that has ever existed. A message sent 500 years ago that somehow, against all odds, got through. Kemp, working with the historian Pascal Cote, whose name will become important very shortly, identified the young woman as Bianca Sforza. This is a name that should make you sit up slightly because Sforza is a dynasty that matters enormously to the story of Milan in the 1490s, and also to the story of Leonardo himself. Bianca was the illegitimate daughter of Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, the same Ludovico who was Leonardo's primary patron for nearly 2 decades. Ludovico, known as Il Moro, was one of the most powerful and complicated men in Italy, which was at the time a peninsula containing an almost incomprehensible density of powerful and complicated men. He was charming, ruthless, politically brilliant, aesthetically sophisticated, and profoundly treacherous, sometimes all in the same afternoon. He liked art. He liked having the best of everything. And in 1482, he simply poached Leonardo from Florence, commissioning him to create a monument to his father. The monument, for what it's worth, was left unbuilt. But Leonardo stayed in Milan for nearly 2 decades, becoming a kind of Renaissance one-man band. Painter, sculptor, engineer, pageant designer, and all-around genius for hire. During this time, he painted The Last Supper, which is either the most famous fresco in the world or an extremely expensive wall in Milan, depending on your perspective. He also painted Ludovico's mistress, Cecilia Gallerani, in the painting known as Lady with an Ermine, one of the most psychologically alive portraits ever made. The ermine squirms with barely contained energy. The lady looks at something slightly off canvas with an expression of such intelligence and control that you feel, 5 centuries later, as though she caught you looking. Bianca Sforza, Ludovico's illegitimate daughter, was 13 or 14 when this portrait is believed to have been made. She was about to be married, a political marriage, as all noble marriages were, to a condottiere named Galeazzo Sanseverino. The portrait, on this theory, was a kind of betrothal gift, a record of the girl being handed off, the way you might today photograph someone departing for a distant life, except painted by Leonardo, which changes the register entirely. She died less than a year after her marriage, probably in childbirth. She was 15. The portrait may be the only image of her that survives. Sit with that for a moment. A girl who lived for 15 years, with barely a record beyond birth, marriage, and death, preserved in 3 dimensions of impossible specificity by the most skilled observer of the human form who ever lived. That is what we might be looking at. That is what we might have been ignoring for 500 years. By 2009, a French scientist and imaging expert named Pascal Cotte had entered the story, and things became considerably more interesting. Cotte had developed a technology called layer amplification method, LAM, which works roughly like a very sophisticated X-ray for paintings, except that instead of bones, it reveals the hidden layers of artistic decision-making beneath the finished surface. He had used it on the Mona Lisa. He had used it on works by Raphael and Vermeer. He was, in short, a man who spent his days looking at what great artists were thinking before they committed to their final choices. What Lam revealed inside La Bella Principessa was astonishing. Beneath the visible surface of the drawing were earlier versions of the image, pentimenti, as art historians call them, from the Italian for regrets. The sitter's head had been adjusted. The positioning of the fingers had changed. These kinds of underdrawing revisions are precisely what you expect to find in a working artist's process, and they align perfectly with similar discoveries in other authenticated Leonardo works. But Cotte found something else, something that became, in its way, one of the most discussed pieces of physical evidence in the entire attribution debate. He found a fingerprint. In the lower left portion of the drawing, embedded into the paint or chalk, was a partial fingerprint. When it was compared to fingerprints found on other definitively attributed Leonardo works, specifically a drawing in Windsor Castle, it showed a striking overlap, a breadcrumb, a ghost. The kind of evidence that, when you add it to everything else, starts to feel like a pattern rather than a coincidence. Leonardo, it seems, had a habit of using his fingertip to smudge and blend, a technique visible across multiple authenticated works. His touch, quite literally the impression of his skin on the surface of things, appears to have left a trace. 500 years later, we were reading his fingerprint like a signature. There is something almost unbearably intimate about the material on which La Bella Principessa is drawn. Vellum, prepared animal skin, typically calf, was expensive, laborious to produce, and associated with the most prestigious commissions of the period. You reach for vellum when something was meant to last. The vellum of La Bella Principessa was examined extensively by conservation scientists. Radiocarbon dating of the material, the process of measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes, the same science used to date archaeological sites and ancient manuscripts, placed it with high probability in the period between 1440 and 1650. A wide window, but one that rules out the possibility of a 19th century forgery, which is what the Christie's catalog had implied. More specifically, examination of the binding holes along the left edge of the drawing revealed something that stopped researchers cold. The vellum had clearly once been part of a book. It had been cut or removed from its binding at some point, leaving characteristic marks. This detail, so small, so easy to overlook, turned out to be a key that unlocked a completely different chapter of the story. Because there is a book that fits. In Warsaw, in the National Library of Poland, there sits a volume known as the Sforza Book of Hours. It was made for Bona Sforza, Queen of Poland, a later Sforza, and it contains exquisite illuminations in the Lombard style of the late 15th century. When researchers examined the binding holes on La Bella Principessa and compared them to the equivalent holes in the Sforza Book of Hours, the alignment was exact. The drawing had, at some point, been cut from that book. Let that sink in. A portrait that might be by Leonardo da Vinci was at some point removed from a royal book, presumably passed through various hands over the centuries, eventually ended up in an auction house labeled as a 19th century German work, and was sold for the price of a modest used car to someone who had completely missed what they were looking at. The history of this object is a comedy of errors sustained for 500 years. The punchline is worth $150 million. It would be dishonest and frankly uninteresting to present this story only through its believers, because the art world is varied and the dissenters are serious. There are credentialed scholars, intelligent, experienced people, who look at La Bella Principessa and see something other than a Leonardo. Their objections are worth taking seriously, because the act of disagreement is how knowledge actually works. The core skeptical position runs something like this. Attribution, especially for drawings and works on paper, is inherently subjective. When someone like Martin Kemp says a work feels like Leonardo, even when he backs that feeling with meticulous technical analysis, he is still exercising judgment, the accumulated weight of experience pressing down on an impression. And judgment can be wrong. The history of art attribution is littered with confident misidentifications in both directions. Works declared masterpieces that turned out to be copies, and works dismissed as copies that turned out to be masterpieces. Some critics have pointed to the quality of execution in certain parts of the drawing, the dress particularly, as inconsistent with Leonardo's known hand. Leonardo's drapery, they argue, has a particular sculptural weight, a sense of fabric obeying gravity that is less evident here. Others have questioned the reconstruction of the Warsaw book connection, arguing that the alignment of the binding holes, while suggestive, falls short of proof. There's also the uncomfortable question of provenance. Before Jean Marchig bought the drawing in 1998, its history is a blank. Where was it for the preceding centuries? Whose walls did it hang on? Who owned it? The silence of the record is, in itself, cause for careful scholars to pause. And yet, the fingerprint, the carbon dating, the binding holes, the technical analysis of the drawing materials, the style, the subject, the context. Each piece of evidence stands alone as suggestive. Together, they form something that feels, to many of the most experienced eyes in the field, like a portrait made at the right time, in the right place, of exactly the right person. This is where scholarship meets philosophy. At what point does an accumulation of circumstantial evidence become something more? At what point does consistent with become almost certainly? The answer, irritatingly, is, it depends who you ask, and that ambiguity is a feature of the system, a sign of its intellectual honesty. To understand La Bella Principessa, to feel it rather than simply know it, you need to know what Leonardo's life looked like in 1496, the year Kemp believes it was made. He was 44 years old. He had been in Milan for 14 years. He was at the absolute height of his powers, which means he was operating at a level of skill and perception that makes even his lesser works feel like they're looking at you rather than the other way around. He had recently finished, or near finished, Leonardo's relationship with finishing being notoriously complicated. The Last Supper on the refectory wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie. He was working simultaneously on notebooks covering hydraulics, optics, human anatomy, and the mathematics of perspective. He had a household that functioned more like a workshop and a family than an office. Students, assistants, a young man named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known as Salai, Salai means little devil, who had joined his household a decade earlier as a child, and who would stay with him until the end, whose precise relationship with Leonardo has been argued over by historians for centuries, with the heat suggesting the argument matters more to us than it did to them. 1496 was also politically a year of gathering tension. Ludovico Sforza was increasingly precarious. The French were watching Milan with the kind of attention that precedes invasion. The Italian peninsula was about to enter a period of savage violence and instability. In this context, Ludovico was making political arrangements with urgent deliberateness, and the betrothal of his daughter Bianca would have been part of that strategic architecture. So, the portrait, if it is what Kemp says it is, was made in a moment of anxiety dressed as celebration. A girl being prepared for marriage, a dynasty trying to secure its future, a man with a brush, or chalk, or both, capturing in precise, luminous detail the face of someone who would be dead within a year. Leonardo was painting the living, oblivious to what came after. But the portrait seems to know it anyway, in the way that great portraiture always seems to know more than the painter could possibly have planned. One of the most striking things about La Bella Principessa is its composition. The strict profile view, the sitter facing left, the black background cutting her figure into sharp relief. Deliberate to the bone, and a clear departure from Leonardo's most famous portraits, which tend toward the three-quarter view. The Mona Lisa, Lady with an Ermine, Ginevra de Benci, all showing the face at an angle that captures both profile and fullness simultaneously. The profile portrait had a specific meaning in the Renaissance context. It was associated with antiquity, with the ancient coins and medals that depicted emperors and rulers in strict profile, an image meant for reproduction and commemoration rather than intimate encounter. A profile portrait says, "This is an official record. This is for history. You observe a profile, acknowledge it, record it." The subject of a profile portrait looks outward at her own future, away from you entirely. But Leonardo, being Leonardo, resisted stopping there. The profile is strict, yes. The composition follows the conventions. And yet, the particular quality of the girl's skin, the way the light catches the bone beneath it, the slight tension around the eyes that might be emotion and might be the discipline required to hold a pose. These things pull the image back toward intimacy. She is simultaneously a type and a person, simultaneously public record and private grief. In short, exactly what a great portrait always is, a paradox that resolves into a face. Here's a chapter that tends to get buried in the romantic narratives about La Bella Principessa, but which is very much part of the story, the lawsuit. In 2010, Jeanne Marchig, the woman who had bought the drawing for $19,000, filed a claim against Christie's auction house for negligence. Her argument ran like this. Christie's had misdescribed the work. They had called it 19th century German when evidence suggested it might be a Renaissance masterwork. They had, she argued, failed in their professional duty to properly research and represent what they were selling. She wanted compensation reflecting the difference between what she paid and what the work was potentially worth. Christie's denied any wrongdoing. Their position was that attribution is inherently uncertain, that they had described the work as they understood it at the time, and that the subsequent reattribution to Leonardo was something they could hardly have been expected to anticipate. The case went through English courts and was resolved in Christie's favor, the courts finding that Christie's had carried out their duty of care. But the lawsuit illuminates something important about the peculiar world of art attribution and art commerce. The gap between what a work is understood to be and what it actually is can translate, in monetary terms, into a difference so vast it beggars ordinary comprehension. And in that gap, there is always someone who benefits and someone who loses. The auction house that sold a Leonardo for $19,000 in 1998 is a very different institution from the one that would sell that work today. The art market, like all markets, runs on information. The question of who had the right information and when, and whether they should have had more, that's a legal question and a moral one in equal measure. Writing about La Bella Principessa without eventually writing about the Mona Lisa is impossible, because the Mona Lisa is Leonardo's shadow. It falls over everything. It precedes every other work into the room. It has colonized our understanding of what a Leonardo portrait is supposed to be, to a degree that makes genuine seeing very difficult. The Mona Lisa is, famously, far from a typical Leonardo. It is the one that survived in the most visible way, the one that ended up in the Louvre, the one that was stolen and recovered and photographed and reproduced until it became something other than a painting. Became instead an icon in the original sense, a sacred image that people travel long distances to stand in front of for approximately 45 seconds, while trying to see it past the heads of 100 other tourists. The painting itself is smaller than most people expect. The crowd is always larger. La Bella Principessa offers perhaps a correction, leaving the Mona Lisa's greatness entirely intact, but challenging the idea that Leonardo's genius expressed itself in a single, reproducible form. The profile composition, the vellum ground, the chalk technique, these are all different from the oil-on-wood, three-quarter view, sfumato-heavy paintings that constitute Leonardo's most famous works. They suggest a practitioner who adapted his tools and approach to the specific demands of each commission, each subject, each moment. A genius who was also a craftsman, who had opinions about materials and methods, who made choices rather than simply channeling inspiration. There is something refreshing about this. The mythology of the artist as pure vessel, the romantic idea that great art simply flows through the gifted individual, unchanged and unchosen, is seductive but wrong. Leonardo was a thinker who worked. La Bella Principessa, with its careful layers of chalk and ink, its adjusted positions, its evidence of revision and reconsideration, is a document of work, a triumph of it. That is everything. A word at this point about the nature of art historical discovery. Because discovery is a word that requires more unpacking than it usually receives. La Bella Principessa was found in a way entirely different from how Tutankhamun's tomb was found, or a new species in a rainforest, or a planet at the edge of the solar system. It was in a sale room, on display, cataloged, available to any expert who walked through the door. The failure was a failure of recognition. And this pattern repeats constantly. The history of art is in large part a history of misrecognition. Works attributed to minor artists that were painted by major ones. Works attributed to major artists that were painted by workshops or imitators. Works dated to entirely the wrong century. Works that spent decades or centuries in storage considered unimportant and then emerged via some combination of changed taste and better technology as significant. The canonical list of great works of art is alive. It is a living document, continuously revised by better-looking, better science, and occasionally the kind of obsessive individual attention that Martin Kemp brought to a photograph in 2007. What this means, in practice, is that the past remains open. The Renaissance is unfinished. There are still things to find above ground in the attics and auction rooms and library basements of the world. There are still conversations to have with the dead, if only we can figure out the language. La Bella Principessa is, among other things, a reminder to look more carefully, to take the mislabeled, the undervalued, the dismissed seriously, to sit with something long enough that it can speak, to bring, when necessary, a machine that sees through paint. I want to come back at the end to Bianca Sforza. The attribution question, the vellum, the fingerprint, all of that can wait outside the door, just her. She was born around 1482, probably in Milan. Her father was one of the most powerful men in Italy and gave her almost none of his time. Her mother was a woman named Bernardina de Corrades, about whom history has preserved almost everything except her character. She is a name on a document, and barely even that. Bianca was illegitimate, which in Renaissance Italy meant a great deal about your status and almost everything about your future if your father was powerless, and very little about your daily treatment if he was powerful enough to decide otherwise. Ludovico legitimized her. He arranged her marriage. He presumably commissioned her portrait. She married Galeazzo Sanseverino, a soldier, a man considerably older than her, probably in 1496. She died probably in 1496 or 1497, probably in childbirth, probably having barely had time to understand what her adult life was going to be before it ended. She was approximately 15 years old. The girl in the portrait looks steady. She looks, if anything, older than 15, her face round and young and very much a child's face, but her posture carrying the absolute composure of someone considerably older. The way she holds the position with a discipline that reads as self-possession rather than rigidity. She has learned already how to perform herself. how to offer a face to history, how to be looked at while keeping herself concealed. And yet, in the specific rendering of her lips, slightly parted, halfway to a smile she then thinks better of, there is something else, something less composed. Leonardo was constitutionally incapable of lying about the human face. Every sitter he painted reveals something they might have preferred to keep to themselves. What Bianca Sforza is about to say in this image, in this moment, 500 years old, that secret is hers alone, sealed in the image, preserved, waiting. And its preservation is the absolute miracle of painting. That is why it matters.